Hi, everybody, and welcome to the all-new Radio and Television Business Report InFOCUS video podcast. I'm your host, Adam R. Jacobson, editor-in-chief here at the Radio and Television Business Report, broadcast media's balanced voice for business, regulatory, and financial news every business day. And you can find us online at rbr.com. The InFOCUS video podcast is presented by .fm. Streaming, social, podcast, or broadcast, get a .fm domain name by heading over to get.fm today. And if you'd like to be a sponsor on this all-new podcast, well, feel free to contact me at adam@rbr.com. I'll personally connect you with one of our relationship-building specialists here at Streamline Publishing. I'd like to introduce our guest on this episode. It is Brad Deutsch, the Office Managing Director and Principal of the law firm of Foster Garvey. He joins us today from Washington, D.C. to discuss Congress, the FCC, broadcast media's future as of today, as we go into the NAB show in early April. It's certainly been a very, very, very active and very busy start to 2025, and it's a pleasure to have you here, Mr. Deutsch.
It's great to be here, Adam. Thank you.
It's been about 2 months or so since Brendan Carr took over as head of the FCC as of the distribution date of this podcast, which was previously recorded. One of the big topics of concern inside the Beltway has been the lack of authority since 2023 to hold spectrum auctions of specific frequencies for wireless communications. Is there anticipation that this will soon change? And why is this important for broadcast radio and TV station owners? And why are spectrum auctions in particular relevant to them today?
Well, so to put context on this, this really goes to the core of the FCC's mission and what the FCC was created to do. I don't know, more than 90 years ago when the FCC was created in the 30s, which is to manage, the spectrum, the airwaves. Spectrum, belongs to all of us. It belongs to the public, but it's a limited resource. You can't just have a free-for-all, or you would have, interference. What now has become a topic that people associate with pirate radios. The idea is that this, by definition, the spectrum needs to be distributed, and it needs to be distributed exclusively, in the sense that someone needs to say, okay, you over there, you can use this frequency in this area, and you over there, you can use this frequency in this area. And that's pretty much always been the FCC's job. And whether that's been their job with respect to the distribution of radio and television licenses and radio and television stations effectively, but also, with wireless carriers and satellites, and, there's use of frequency, all kinds of frequencies, as we all very well know, with TV, the transition to digital and the repack, which maybe we'll talk about as part of this discussion. But the bottom line is, over time, the commission and the country has kind of, reiterated and changed the way that we distribute those licenses and those exclusive rights to use those frequencies. And starting in 1993, we decided, we being the government, decided that the most efficient way to distribute new spectrum was through auctions, which basically means, the highest, whoever's willing to pay the highest price, presumably is the person or entity that values it the most, and therefore will make the best use of it. And so it's just open up for anybody who wants to bid on these things. Of course, inherently, we shouldn't be naive about this. That is a decision about winners and losers, just like every government decision creates winners and losers. The winners in an auction world are the entities that have the money, who can be the highest bidders. It used to be, before there were auctions, that the FCC would literally conduct hearings where we would have a judge decide who the best entity would be to run that radio station or to run that TV station, according to all kinds of criteria, like whether they have a local presence, how much news they were pledging to produce. We don't do that anymore. I'm not saying which one's better, which one's worse, but we went to auctions. I guess it's been a couple of years now that in 1993 was the first auction authority, and then it kept getting extended and extended and extended. And over time, I guess there were auctions for 30 years from 1993 to 2023. There were about 100 auctions or over 100 auctions, not just radio and television. And this led to revenues for the government of over $200 billion. So this is a significant, revenue generator as well for the country. And it's not like that money goes to the FCC. That money goes to the Treasury for the government's general budget. In 2023, the authority was just not extended to continue the auctions, and the FCC lost its authority to conduct auctions across the board. And it's one of these weird things because no one can really pinpoint exactly who is against auctions. There's no coalition or trade association or interest group for the most part that is anti-auction here. What I think is happening is that auction authority has become hijacked to be part of a larger debate about spectrum allocation, and more importantly, just about an overhaul of the Communications Act in general. So I think there are interests at play that are saying, well, let's hold this as a bargaining chip so that when we try to push for some kind of omnibus larger reform of the Communications Act, we can extract something theoretically from someone over there. Who knows what that thing is going to be? And this is the way that laws get made, unfortunately. This is the way the sausage is made. And in the meantime, there just aren't any auctions going forward. Now, it's not clear to me how much pressure is building up at the agency with respect to what effectively is now 2 years without auction authority. The FCC in a year ago, I think, in March of 2024, issued a public notice saying, hey, we haven't had this auction authority for a year. We're worried that it's going to hold up innovation. We're worried that by not providing more spectrum, especially in the wireless space, cell phones and data, is this going to have a consequence on our country moving forward with respect to technology, and specifically with keeping up with the rest of the world? That public notice was issued in March, April of 2024. And it was really interesting to me that only 16 comments have been filed to date in that, what the FCC calls a docket. There were 9 reply comments. No broadcasters commented at all. The commenters were basically T-Mobile, Verizon, some electric utility companies. The closest that we got was EchoStar, which is, Dish TV.
But this is where I need to ask, because no broadcasters commented. It brings the question to light of, well, why is this then important to a radio and TV station ownership group? I mean, we saw some TV station licensees pocket hundreds of millions of dollars in the repack. And this brings the question of, well, are we setting ourselves up for a second TV repack? Could there ever be a radio repack where radio stations could get hundreds of millions of dollars, which I'm sure that any NAB member would love to hear at this point, considering all the core advertising woes?
So that's an interesting question. Two things. One is the first part of your question was broadcasters didn't participate. Does it really have an impact on broadcasters? And one part of my answer is no, there really isn't that much demand by broadcasters for new radio and television stations, which I think is related, and we'll probably get to this later about ownership restrictions. But and I don't know off the top of my head when it was, but the last time that there was an auction of new FM stations, many of the stations didn't even have bidders. They're just, these were the stations, the spectrum that is available tends to be in rural communities where there just isn't enough interest to have a viable radio station. So I'm not sure on that side of the equation whether there is, where the broadcasters are chomping at the bit to get new frequencies. Now, it's interesting what you just said, which is what's the flip side of that? How do broadcasters make money in an auction? that doesn't seem intuitive to me. At an auction, you bid and you spend money to get new spectrum. But it turns out that broadcasters actually made money in auctions. And this is, without getting into all the details, but there was something that was called a reverse auction. So what happened was, and this is kind of getting to your answer, at some point, it was, the world changed and we got cell phones. And it turned out, lo and behold, the spectrum that TV stations were using was ideal for cell phone usage. So this is something that when those licenses were first given out to television stations, there was no such thing as cell phones, but the world changes, technology changes. Spectrum is a limited resource, and it turns out the very spectrum that TV stations were using, to a large extent, was ideal for the use of at least some technologies related to cell phones, and specifically T-Mobile, and Verizon were very effective. Were very, it was very attractive to them. So what the FCC devised is they said, well, and again, this is very wonky, but at the same time that the FCC mandated that TV stations converted from analog to digital, it turns out that TV stations could operate much more efficiently in smaller amounts of spectrum. And so the FCC said to TV stations, hey, we think that your spectrum might be more valuable to wireless carriers than it is to you. If you want, you can name your price and see whether or not they're willing to pay your price. And instead of paying the government to get the spectrum, the money will go to you because you're already using that spectrum. And a lot of TV stations actually raised their hands to do this. And again, it got very complicated because in many cases, the TV stations either already had a second channel that they could use instead. So they were giving away nothing effectively. And that happened a lot of the public television stations. Or because of the technology advances and being able to operate more efficiently on the 1.6 megahertz channel, they were able to share. A lot of stations now share the spectrum between two stations on one license. And the FCC created a new regulatory scheme to allow that to happen. So effectively, one station would say, yeah, I'll give you back my station, my frequency. I'll go share with that guy over there. And in the meantime, let's see how much a wireless carrier will pay me to give back my spectrum. Millions and millions of dollars. Some broadcasters made in what was called the reverse auction. Do I think that's going to happen again? Adam, what do you? I would be making it up if I could guess. I think it depends. I have not heard anything about FM spectrum being useful to wireless carriers. But who knows? 10 years from now, 20 years from now. I mean, I keep reminding myself, and I'm not sure of the exact date, but how long ago was it that the iPhone came out? It's less than 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think it was 2007, 2008. I mean, I was still using a Motorola phone or something like that. Mind-boggling, right?
Right. It's ubiquitous. We're all completely dependent upon our iPhones now or smartphones now. And as we all know, technology is exponential. So who knows what the world is going to look like 10 years from now? And I certainly don't. So it's interesting that on the one hand, I think that there isn't much, demand for new radio and television stations to use spectrum for auctions. But could auctions have a benefit? Sure. And especially now with TV converting into ATSC 3.0, who knows what that's going to bring as well.
We're going to take a quick break from our sponsor, .fm. We'll be back in a minute with Brad Deutsch from Foster Garvey right after this message.
Whether you're launching the next big podcast, building a vibrant social community, or broadcasting your brand to the world, .fm is your signal to stand out. Don't just stream, streamline your success with .fm. Claim yours today at www.get.fm.
And we thank .fm for their sponsorship of this InFOCUS video podcast. I'm Adam R. Jacobson in Boca Raton, Florida, and we welcome back to our podcast Brad Deutsch from Foster Garvey. Well, we certainly talked about spectrum auction authority at the FCC, and that's just one topic of focus that broadcast media may have when it comes to the rapidly changing regulatory climate in Washington. Is there any indication that local ownership limits are now under review and ripe for rule modernization under FCC Chairman Brendan Carr?
Well, this is a good segue because on the one hand, when my takeaway was I'm not sure that there's much appetite from broadcasters for new, stations through auctions. I think there is an appetite for acquisition at the local level for existing broadcasters to buy up competitors, whether that's TV or radio. And there are many ownership restrictions that are in place right now that prevent that kind of consolidation. So I think that this is a real space that there's a specific debate going on, and I think under a Carr administration with Brendan Carr joining the FCC, he's been pretty vocal as a commissioner before he became the chairman that he opposes these restrictions and he thinks that the commission should be getting rid of these restrictions. There's a fascinating thing that happens at the FCC that the Congress has told the FCC that every 4 years it has to revisit these broadcast ownership rules, and it has to make an affirmative determination that the existing broadcast ownership rules remain in the public interest. And if they don't remain in the public interest, they affirmatively have to get rid of the rules. So every 4 years, the commission launches what it calls a quadrennial proceeding to revisit these things. It's a mess, though. It's a complete mess. It used to be, interestingly, that originally Congress said you have to do this every 2 years, a biennial review.
Yeah, can you imagine?
The FCC, it was just like complete explosion. So they were always 6 years behind in the last biennial. So now they're only 2 years behind because it's a quadrennial. But it's just constantly, it's kind of like my dog chasing her tail. But I want to kind of dig in a little. Public interest is defined as, localism, competition, diversity of viewpoints, programming, ownership. These are the mandates of the FCC in determining whether or not the ownership restrictions make sense. The big debate has been over the last 10, 15 years that TV and radio don't operate in a vacuum. They're not only competing with other TV and radio stations, they're now competing with the internet, which has no ownership restrictions whatsoever. And everybody agrees. I mean, I don't think it's very controversial to say that if the FCC were to wipe the slate clean today and decide based on the way the world is today, what, if any, ownership restrictions should be in place, there is no way that we would arrive at the rules that we have now. And to just go through it very, very quickly, and I'm sure I'm going to miss nuance on this. The current rules are that you can't own 2 television stations in a given DMA if those 2 television stations have overlapping signals. If both stations are in the top 4 rated in that market. So you can own a top 4 station and a number 5 station and number 6 station in the market, but you can't own 2 top 4 stations. Similarly, the top 4 networks are not allowed to merge. So that's on the TV side. On the radio side, it gets much more complicated, and it depends on how big your market is, and how the size of a market is determined is craziness, especially in markets that aren't Nielsen rated. But essentially, in the largest markets, you can own up to 8 stations, no more than 5 in one service, either FM or AM. But in the smallest markets, which are the markets that are defined as 14 or fewer stations, you can own up to 5 stations but you can't own more than 50% of the stations in the market. So you have a market that only has 6 stations. The most you can own is 3 stations in that market. So that's overall. And then on top of it, there's also this national cap, flipping back to TV, that you can't own TV stations across the country. I think I wrote it down.
39%.
39%.
Right.
But there's a perfect example. So you can't own TV stations across the country if you add up all your TV stations that cover 39% of the population. But UHF stations are only counted as for 50% of their coverage. So whatever population they cover, you just divide it by 2. That is a pure anachronistic rule that it comes from when UHF stations were not the strong stations pre-digital. Now UHF stations are the strong stations in the digital world. So there's no reason to have a 50% discount. And the commission has flip-flopped on that. I think it was Chairman Wheeler under Obama got rid of the 50% discount, and then immediately when Chairman Pai came in under Trump 1.0, he put it back in, and now it's in there. But again, like, no one would ever think of putting a 50% UHF discount if we were starting from scratch today.
Of course.
It makes no sense.
But it's just part of the regulatory environment we have, where we have rural monetization needs, and that modernization is also balanced against an industry that, well, quite frankly, may not want that discount.
There you go.
Let's shift the conversation to other topics of interest that are happening on Capitol Hill, mainly the Local Radio Freedom Act and the American Music Fairness Act. It's gaining a lot of attention again as pro-music industry groups launch another effort to try to squeeze the turnip, if you will, and get more money out of the radio industry. We know that Senator Marsha Blackburn, who when was in the House, ran the House Energy and Commerce Committee, is supporting this. We've heard from Jelly Roll, who we actually had on the cover of Radio Ink magazine a year ago. And, here he is kind of turning his back at radio, if you will. What is the discussion, at least among people in your world, when it comes to how important this issue is in Washington?
I think it's important in the sense that it would have incredible consequences on radio stations if they started to have to pay what's called performance fee royalties for playing music on their stations. But even though that's true, it would have an incredible impact on the bottom line, because it would really, it would be a huge amount of a payment. I just don't see it happening, quite frankly. And again, if you ask my friends and family, they would say anytime Brad says something like that, like, it's always wrong. So with a grain of salt, I still don't see it happening. Marsha Blackburn did introduce again the American Music Fairness Act, which is a pro-musician proposal, pro-musician bill that would impose, would actually tell the Copyright Royalty Office to go figure out how much licensing fees radio stations should pay for carrying music. It doesn't have that much support in Congress. It kind of, I think it fights above its weight, in the sense that you do have Jelly Roll and you have, music stars that are able to put their weight behind it. And we know that anytime you have, Congress tends to get a little starstruck. So anytime you have famous people walking the halls and talking to staff and talking to members, it gets a little more attention than it would get otherwise. Whereas on the other side, there aren't that many radio station owners who kind of make members starstruck. So I think it doesn't get as much attention. But that said, I think that the support, 114 members supported the Local Radio Freedom Act, which is really a non-binding thing. It's not a real bill. It's just basically saying, we don't support changing the rule. I don't think it's going to happen. One of the interesting things about this debate, though, is that it involves foreign reciprocal rights. So the one argument that kind of strikes me is that even in countries that do have a performance royalty fee, when U.S. artists are played on the radio in those countries, they don't get those royalty fees, precisely because we don't pay them here. Because the idea is that, so like, I'm making this up, I don't know if like French artists get royalty fees or not, but when a French artist is paid in America, which I guess it's not that often. They don't get royalty fees. Anybody else doesn't get royalty fees. But because we don't give French artists royalty fees, when American artists are played in France, they don't get royalty fees, even if they would otherwise if they weren't an American artist. So that's that. I think that kind of ups the ante of the chess game. But I still think that this is interesting, worth following. I don't think it's going to go anywhere.
Let's talk a little bit about AM radio. Look, to some, it might be a relic of bygone days, but for millions of Americans, it is a vital communications link to emergency information and news. We have the AM Radio for Every Vehicle Act now gaining steam in this conference. It's making significant progress. By the time we drop this, who knows, it could be law. What are you hearing from your vantage point about this bill?
Yeah, so the remarkable thing about this bill is, well, first of all, 43 senators are already supporting it, and the two senators that are introducing it are Ted Cruz and Ed Markey. I don't think Ted Cruz and Ed Markey could even agree on what restaurant to go to. I don't think there's anything they've ever agreed on before. So I think it's worth noting that they agree on this, and I think in your introduction, it can't be overstated that even though, a lot of people might say, oh, I don't listen to AM anymore. There are a lot of people who do listen to AM, especially in rural communities, agricultural communities, and also in underserved communities. AM radio serves a vital purpose in this country. And the car manufacturers, on the one hand, they're saying that they're, not including AM radio because it's an expense that they can eliminate. I don't think that's really what's going on, right? It's all about, dashboard space now. As we all go to these, smart dashboards in our cars, they want you to go to their content. And mind you, U.S. automakers have all invested in content that is on your dashboard. And they have not invested in AM stations, I can tell you that. They don't want AM stations. They just want to eliminate one form of competition. I think this was introduced in 2023, seemed to have a lot of support, got out of committee, seemed like it was on track to get voted into law, and then for various political reasons stalled. I think that, as you said, there's a very good chance that by the time that this podcast airs, that this will be law.
Okay, one final question for you before we wrap up, and thank you again, Brad, for taking time out. On February 18th, an executive order from the White House emerged that would effectively place the FCC, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Securities and Exchange Commission under pretty much a big microscope, allowing the president to have the final say in any significant regulatory policy reported order. I'm wondering what you can share about this in terms of the reaction from at least some of your clients, what people are saying inside the Beltway. And, we expect court challenges. Again, who knows what the environment is going to be come early April, as we're taping this in March. But I would have to think that this will not stand, and there's going to be a lot of fighting against this. What are your people saying?
So as with many of Trump's executive orders, you don't know exactly what's going to happen with them, what they mean. Often they're not drafted, all that comprehensively and diligently. This one's an exception. I think this one was actually drafted, more carefully than other executive orders have been drafted. But at the same time, unfortunately, when this executive order came out, it came out, late in the evening on one day, and the very next day, Ukraine became a huge news topic because Trump was saying, things about Ukraine that were pretty unprecedented, and therefore this didn't get much coverage at all. So it's interesting to me that there hasn't been that much a reaction to this because people have been distracted by other things, and that's seems to have been happening a lot with Trump administration changes. That said, I just want to be clear that it's this Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, which is an office within the White House that reviews draft regulations, has existed for a long time, and has had a role for a long time. But that said, their role has been limited to major rulemakings, and I think that's has been defined in the past as $500 million or more, or something like that. So we don't know what the definition is going to be now going forward. But at the same time, it also has been limited to, like, they've played an important role to make sure that one agency isn't changing a rule over here when another agency is changing a rule in a different direction over there, to kind of synthesize, make sure that the government agencies are talking to each other. They haven't had as much a role as putting their thumb on the scale of which rules to go forward, which rules not to go forward. The whole tenor of the executive order is, agencies run amok, which is consistent with, what he's doing in trying to trim down the government and specifically, I mean, to be clear, all the people who work at the FCC pretty much got the fork in the road email, right? I mean, this is something that is actually impacting the folks who are working at the FCC. And I think that the tenor of this executive order is, you guys, you can't even take a step without checking in with us first and getting our sign off. And if that is in fact something that winds up taking hold, it really will change in many ways the way that expert agencies across the government operate, including the FCC.
All right. With that, we are out of time, so we're going to have to say thank you so much. It's been great talking to you, and I'm sure there will be another opportunity to talk about a lot of other things impacting radio and television in Washington in the coming months. So from Foster Garvey, Brad Deutsch, we thank you so much for being a part of this video podcast.
Thanks, Adam. It's my pleasure.
All right. And thank you for watching this all-new radio and television business report InFOCUS video podcast. It was sponsored by .fm, streaming, social, podcast, or broadcast. Get a .fm domain name by heading over to get.fm today. The InFOCUS video podcast is copyright 2025 by Streamline Publishing and is produced and distributed on the StreamYard platform from our headquarters in Boca Raton, Florida. From the home of both Radio Inc. magazine and the Radio and Television Business Report at RBR.com, I'm Adam R. Jacobson. Be sure to find us at RBR.com every business day for the freshest news in broadcast media. We'll see you next time. Take care.